play and call it work. MiniWarGaming's Faction Focus!
Hey everybody, Matthew here from MiniWarGaming.com, and welcome to today's Faction Focus Tyranids. I'm very excited to be talking about the Tyranids and how they have changed in 8th edition. So today there are 4 videos that have been put up. The first 2 are my review of the new Tyranids, which will include me going through and talking about all the changes to the Tyranids. And the second part of that review will then be going through some Tactica. Not tons of Tactica, just because I've only played them a few times. But basically what I want to do is go over some list builds that I think are going to be effective in 8th edition with the new Tyranids. At least until the tournament people tweak them and find out exactly where the meta is for 8th edition. So that'll be a 2-part review. The first one right here, the second part in the MiniWarGaming Vault at the link below. The other 2 videos, of course, are a couple of battle reports, one free, one vault. The first one is Tyranids vs. Astra Militarum, where I actually try out a lot of close combat stuff, Gene Stealers, Flying Hive Tyrant, Brood Lord, that kind of stuff. And the second battle report in the vault is Tyranids vs. Tau, or Tau, if you want to add that little apostrophe in there. It's not supposed to be that, it's supposed to be Tau. And that one was against Cullen, which was really interesting because we went up to a full 100 power level, which is equivalent to roughly 2,000 points. So it was a big game. And so I had a mixture of close combat. Actually, it was, once again, it was a much close combat army, because the one thing I wanted to see is in 8th edition, can I play my Tyranids close combat like, as opposed to 7th edition, where you had to really utilize a few tricks as well as some shooting and a lot of psychic in order to make them work. And I will be talking about that. So in these reviews, there will be spoilers, somewhat. I'm not going to tell you the outcome of the battle reports, but I am going to be talking about things that happened. And so that will be a form of a spoiler. So if you want to, you can stop this video and go and watch those battle reports first. There will be links to them in the video description below. So go and check those out first, and then come back and watch this so you kind of have a bit of background as to why I'm talking about things the way I do. So to answer the first question, can Tyranids play the close combat game? The answer is absolutely. Things have improved greatly for them. What I'm going to do here, I'm going to start off by talking about the general rules of the Tyranids that have changed, like Synapse, their psychic stuff, Shadow and the Warp. And then I'm going to go through really quickly every unit in the book and talk about what has really changed for them and how they play now. Now, there's a few units I haven't played with yet, but having played with the rest of them, I think I can give you a pretty good idea of how they will work on the table, because things have kind of been simplified in a good way, and that once you've played 8th edition enough, you can start to look at the stats and realize what they can do, although there's obviously going to be hidden nuances that you can miss. So let's start by talking about the main rules for the Tyranids. The first question that's probably on a lot of Tyranid players' minds is, how has Synapse changed? And it has changed dramatically. First off, the default Synapse range is only 8 inches, except for Hive Tyrants and Swarm Lords, where they have a special rule that extends it to 12. And anybody within Synapse automatically passes morale tests. Now, if you've been watching any of the battle reports, you realize how big a deal that is, especially for the big groups like the Hormagaunts, Termagants, and even the Gene Stealers and Ripper Swarms, things like that. Also, if you're not in Synapse and you have the Instinctive Behavior rule, which pretty much everything has, unless it's a Synapse creature or it's a Gene Stealer, so Gene Stealer don't have Instinctive Behavior, just like before, their Instinctive Behavior is not nearly as bad. It forces them, if they want to shoot the nearest target, and if they want to charge, to declare charge only against the nearest visible enemy unit. Now, both cases it's nearest visible. So when you're shooting, nearest visible, charging, nearest visible. So it's not nearly as bad. There's no table lookups. There's no chance of eating your own guys. There's no chances of running away or just kind of standing around going all dirt face. So they've really, really simplified it. And I remember that the rules that you're seeing now, I would call them a stopgap. In other words, they had to quickly update everything. So I found that they've simplified, which I'm really enjoying. I wouldn't be surprised when the next Tyranid book comes out that they do modify the Synapse and Instinctive Behavior, just to give them a bit more flavor than what they are right now. But what this means is Synapse is important, but it's not nearly as important as it was in 7th edition. So you could actually build an entire army with no Synapse and get away with it. You'll have to be a little more careful about where you move your guys, because where you move them is totally up to you. So obviously if you want to shoot a certain target, you're going to want to move the guy so that the closest visible enemy is that target. Now, it will prevent you from firing at targets further away, and that will give you some disadvantages. So you're still going to want to do Synapse, but at least it's not as bad when you don't get it. The other big change is Shadow and the Warp. It kind of sucked in 7th edition because they didn't really change its rules because it was -3 leadership to psychers within 12 inches of a Synapse creature. And that was great back when in 6th edition you had to do a leadership check to pass a psychic test. But then in 7th they got rid of that, and so the -3 leadership kind of mattered. It helped with Perils of the Warp, but for the most part it didn't do much. Now, if you're within 8 inches of anything with Shadow in the Warp and you are a psyker and not a Tyranid psyker, that matters if you're playing Tyranids versus Tyranids, then they get -1 to their psychic tests. So if they have to roll a 6+, now they're going to have to roll a 7+. And the nice thing about Smite is normally when you roll a 5+ for Smite, you get D3 mortal wounds, and a 10+ will become D6. Now they'll have to roll a 6+ to get the D3 and an 11+ to get the D6. So Shadow in the Warp is actually good. Furthermore, the Hive Mind discipline has been simplified. If you've been watching, you'll have noticed maybe that the disciplines for all the psychic powers have been down to, or pretty much reduced down to 3 in each of them. Once again, I think this is temporary until they come out with the full rules for each of the armies. So the 3 that they chose for the Tyranids I like. We got the Horror, which is a 6+ to cast, 24 inches. You choose an enemy unit that's visible within 24 inches, and until the next psychic phase, until your next psychic phase, they get -1 on hit rolls and leadership. It just has hit rolls, so that works both in shooting and close combat. That is a big deal. Having played a bunch of games now, that is a big deal. The leadership is nice. Basically it means if they're going to do a morale test, then they're likely to lose 1 more guy. But the big deal right there is the -1 hit. Another one is Catalyst. You choose any Tyranid unit friendly within 18 inches. On a 6+ you get it. And they essentially get a 5+ Feel No Pain. It's not called Feel No Pain, it's just called Catalyst. But they ignore wounds and mortal wounds on a 5+. That is really, really nice. And then the third one is Onslaught, probably my favorite one. An 18-inch, 6+ to cast on a Tyranid-friendly unit. And basically, the shooting part is nice. They don't suffer any penalties for moving and shooting if they're heavy or advancing and shooting assault weapons. But the big part is, in addition, that unit can also charge this turn, even if they advanced. So now with match play, only being able to use each psychic power once per phase, you won't be able to spam Onslaught. I think that's what I would do. If there was no rule of 1 for psychic powers except for Smite, I'd probably put as many psychers as I could on the board, advance everything, and then cast Onslaught on everything. But you can only use it once, which forces you to use all of your powers, and then if you have extras left over, then you use a lot of Smite. But Onslaught is awesome, lets you advance a unit and then charge. Now, the only problem is if you're advancing and you could have charged if you didn't advance, but you wanted to get a little closer, and you fail to cast Onslaught, well then of course you will not be able to charge at all, which really sucks. So that's the basic changes. It's really simple. Synapse, Instinctive Behavior, Shadow in the Warp, and the psychic powers are really straightforward. Of course, all the psychers know Smite as well, and some of them have some special abilities like Malice Scepters, which we'll get to. But that is it for the general rules. So now let's go into talking about the changes to the models. Now hold on to your pants because this is going to be a bit rapid fire because I want to go through every single unit in the book and tell you what's changed from 7th to 8th in this part, because the second part I want to dedicate to list building. So I'm just going to cover the most important things and spend more time on the models that really have the biggest difference. So the first up, we have some of our HQ choices. We're going to talk about the Hive Tyrant and the Swarm Lord. Hive Tyrant now, he's what you think he should be before. He's really good in close combat, he's good at shooting, he has access to all those monstrous shooting weapons. Now, there's one thing to point out, and this is going to affect Hive Tyrants, this is going to affect Carnufexes the most, is that one thing I noticed that Games Workshop did for the rules is anything before that was twin-linked now is just twice as many shots. With the exception, this is the only exception I can find so far, of the twin-linked Devours. The big Flyrant, Daka Flyrant in the Daka Carnufexes was a Hive Tyrant with 2 sets of twin-linked Devours, and that would give him 12 strength 6 shots at 18-inch range that he would be able to re-roll. And since he's hitting on 3s, that was really nice. And the Carnufexes, they would only be hitting on 4s, but having 12 shots, but they get the twin-linked, that all of a sudden that 4+ isn't too bad. But for some reason, the Devours didn't get doubled. And so when you take the 2 sets of Devours, you still only get 12 shots, but you no longer get twin-linked. So that's a kind of a big disappointment. The nice thing is they did introduce an upgrade to the Death Spitter. It's a Death Spitter with some sort of extra thing on it. What's it called? Because it's Devour with Brain Leech Worms, Death Spitters with Slimer Maggots. And so it's basically a strength 7 -1 3-shot weapon. So you're probably going to see that become the new Daka Flyrant, is having 2 sets of the Death Spitters, so he'll have 12 Strength 5, or Strength 5 minus 1, no, sorry, Strength 7 minus 1 shots. But once again, losing the Twin Linked. What it should have been, I'm wondering if it's just a typo, but we're not going to play it as if it was a typo. Obviously, we'll play it rules as written, because what it should have been, given the pattern they followed with pretty much every other Twin Linked weapon I've seen, is they should have all of a sudden been 24 shots instead of 12. You might think, well, that's a lot. Well, you're right. But when you look at everything else, they're getting their double shots. Assault cannons now are like 8 shots, or twin linked assault cannons are 8 shots. You look at the Tau and all their broadsides with all those twin links, they just doubled the shots on all of them. That seems to have been what they did across the board, with exception, and there may be others, but I haven't looked through everything, to the twin link Devourers. So that's a big deal, more for the Carnufexes, which we'll talk about later. But the Hive Tyrants, I think the big buff that they're getting is flying Hive Tyrants. They no longer fly around like flyers. They just become, if you think about it in 7th edition, they're like jump monstrous creatures, but they get to move 16 inches, and that's pretty big, especially when you consider how good the Hive Tyrant's going to be in close combat against infantry, but more particularly against other monsters and other vehicles, because he has his monstrous Scything Talons by default, which are going to be Strength 6, minus 3 AP, 3 damage apiece, and you get to reroll 1s to hit. And he's hitting on 2s already, so he's pretty much 2+ rerollable in close combat. And like I said before, he has a 12-inch Synapse, and he actually has an Invuln now, 5-up Invuln, which is really nice, and he can do 2 psychic powers just like before. The Swarm Lord is also pretty awesome. He can't be given wings still, but he has a 9-inch move now instead of his 6-inch before, so he can actually get into combat. His Bone Sabers are pretty neat. They're when he's at full health, they're Strength 8, minus 3 AP, D6 wounds apiece. And on top of that, he has a 5-up Invuln, period, whereas before he'd only have an Invuln in close combat, and he gets +1 to that Invuln in close combat. So he's got his 4-up Invuln in close combat still, but he now has a 5-up Invuln outside of that, which both the Hive Tyrant and the Swarm Lord desperately needed. And not that I'm a big fan of the proliferation of Invulns in 8th edition, but 5-up Invulns I think are okay. It's more when you get to the 4-up and 3-ups that I can start to not like them. On top of that, the Swarm Lord has a really cool ability, and probably one of the most powerful abilities that you'll see in the entire Tyranid Codex, is that in each of the shooting phases he can pick one friendly Tyranid unit within 6 inches of the Swarm Lord, and that unit can move and advance if you wish, as if it were the movement phase instead of shooting. Now with movements for a lot of your close combat guys being 7 or 8 or 9, and he could choose himself as well for that, being able to move twice, essentially if he chooses Hormagaunts nearby, they're going to be able to move 16 inches, because they move 8 normally, and charge, which is huge. It's absolutely ridiculous. I used him in my game against the Tau, and that ability was awesome. I used it. I used it 3 times, 1 for Hormagaunts, 1 for himself, and 1 for the Tyrant Guard that he left behind when he used it on himself, and it was ridiculously good. So Swarm Lord is awesome. He's good in close combat. He gets to do 2 psychic powers, but I think the big thing is the ability to allow a unit to move twice, especially with the new movement values. Old One Eye is awesome now. His points level has dropped. I think it has dropped, but either way, it feels like it's dropped compared to everything else. And he's actually really good. Not only is he good himself in close combat, he's got a 3+ to hit, but he's got an aura power. So it's called Alpha Leader, where all Carnufexes within 6 inches, and he's always within 6 inches, and he has the Carnufex rule, get +1 to hit in close combat, in fight phase, and that includes himself. So he's actually a 2+ to hit. If he uses his Scything Talons, he gets to reroll 1s. But if he wants to really get powerful, he can go up to Strength 14 with his Crushing Claws, but then he gets -1 to hit, because it's anything that had unwieldy before, I'm noticing they're just -1 to hit, like Power Fist, Thunderhammers, that kind of stuff. And so he'll go back up to 3+ to hit. But if you consider 3+ to hit, but Strength 14, that's pretty awesome. Now mind you, the Scything Talons will be 2+ to hit re-rolling, so they're going to hit way more. But if you need to hit those high toughness, high wound targets, then you want to use them. They actually both do the same number of wounds. They both do 3 damage per wound. And then for the infantry, he's got his tail, which is awesome with Thresher Scythe. It's Strength 4, -1 AP, 1 damage, but every attack you make with it is D3 hits. And he has 5 attacks base, so he could do 5 D3 attacks with it at Strength 4, -1. So he's also going to be awesome against groups of infantry. He'll just be able to swipe them away. On top of that, you'll find the Carnufexes have a rule that when they charge on a 4+, they deal a mortal wound to an enemy unit within 1 inch. Well, he has the same rule, except it's D3 mortal wounds instead of just 1. And he has Berserk Rampage still, that every successful to hit roll, he gets another attack, but those don't stack. And when you consider using the Scything Talons, he's hitting on 2s, re-rolling 1s, and he's got 5 attacks. He's most likely going, if you use Scything Talons, and the enemy you're up against doesn't give you any negative modifiers, you're most likely going to get 9 or 10 attacks with the Scything Talons. Even the Crushing Claws you should be able to do pretty well with. So he's awesome. He's an HQ choice, and there's even a detachment that lets you bring 1 HQ and then 3 to 6 heavy support, so you could actually build an all Carnufex army, and with a new Instinctive Behavior, it'll actually work well. Broodlord is awesome too. He is an HQ choice now instead of an upgrade, so yes, you can make an all Genestealer army in your Tyranid army. You don't have to play Genestealer Cult anymore, and considering the Genestealers are now the same in both Genestealer Cult and Tyranids, that's awesome. The Genestealers and the Broodlord can all charge even if they advance, and they all have a movement of 8, so this guy is going to move fast, he's going to advance, and he's going to charge after that too, and all Genestealers within 6 inches of him, they get +1 in the fight phase. And he has a Genestealer special rule too, so he gets +1. Now he's already a 2+ to hit, so it becomes a 1+. You always fail 1s, but it's nice because if anything gives him a -1 to hit, then he basically negates that. So he's essentially a 1+ to hit, just always. There's really never a change to that. And he's a Psyker, and he's a Synapse creature now, which he wasn't before. He had to cast the power Dominion to become a Synapse creature, but now just by default he is. So you want to run an all Genestealer list, I think it's actually going to be viable against most of the armies you're up against. And he has a 5-up invuln, so he can stay alive from some shooting, which is nice. Tyranid Primes are awesome too. Before, if they were in a unit of warriors, they would allow them to use their weapon skill and ballistic skill. Now all Tyranid warriors and Tyranid shrikes within 6 inches get +1. You're going to notice that. You've seen a trend here. Carnufex, or the old One-Eye gives +1 to Carnufexes. The Broodlord gives +1 to Genestealers. Well, Tyranid Primes give +1 to Tyranid warriors and Tyranid shrikes. And that includes themselves. Oh, actually, sorry. In this case, it doesn't include themselves because they don't actually have the Tyranid warrior or Tyranid shrike keyword, but they're already a 2+ to hit in close combat. And this is +1 to hit to everything. It doesn't say in the fight phase. So this buffs your warriors to be better shooters, and it also buffs them to be better in close combat as well. He's got the usual set of weapons, the Scything Talons, Flesh Hooks, he's got Devourers, you can give him some better weapons. You can upgrade him for Adrenal Glands and Toxin Sacs. Adrenal Glands now give you +1 to your advance and charge, what's awesome. And Toxin Sacs are okay too. If you roll a 6 to wound, you get +1 damage. So that's really good if you're fighting a multi-wound creature. Not so good if you're just fighting droves of infantry, but it's not a bad upgrade to have. Tervigon's got a serious buff, and at the same time a little bit of a nerf when it comes to spawning Gaunts. At the end of your movement phase, any Tervigon can spawn Termagants. He can create a new unit of 10, but in match play there's a rule that if you want to actually create new units, whether by summoning or spawning or any other way, you actually have to have points set aside to create those. So if I wanted to bring in Termagants, I'd have to know ahead of time I was going to do that and set aside points. I don't actually have to buy Termagants, I just have to have excess points. So if I play in a 2,000 point game, then I could set aside 100 or 200 points to spawn Termagants with. But that being a disadvantage, the advantage is they still get to move forward, they can advance, they can spawn those Gaunts 6 inches forward, and then those Gaunts are free to shoot and charge if they want to, which is pretty awesome. Alternatively, you can reinforce an existing group of Termagants. You can add more, and by the way, this is always Flesh Borer Gaunts. You can never do it with Devour Gaunts. But you can re-add any Gaunts that they lost earlier in the game for free. You don't have to set aside points for that because the rule for match play is if you're creating new units, you got to pay points. But if you're resurrecting, like Apothecaries do that, the Tervagons can do that with Termagants, then you don't have to pay for that. So what I found in my one game against Dave was that I'd have a 20-man squad of Termagants, 10 with Devourers, which are really good shooting, and 10 with Flesh Borers, and he just wasn't able to really hurt them because the Tervagon just stayed nearby and just reinforced them. Just whatever he killed, I would always kill the Flesh Borer Gaunts first because you can choose which ones die first, and then he'd reinforce them. The Tervagon's also a Psyker, and he gives re-rolling to hit rolls of 1 in the shooting phase for friendly Termagants within 6 inches, so it makes their shooting a little bit better. Give them Devourers, and all of a sudden they're really good. On top of that, the Tervagon got a serious buff in close combat because he's got massive Crushing Claws or massive Scything Talons, which is pretty awesome. They both do D6 damage, and they're both -3 AP. If you choose the Scything Talons, he gets to reroll 1s, but it's only strength 7. You choose the Crushing Claws, then he'll hit on 5, so I'm not sure how good those will be, but they're still useful to some extent. But they're strength 14 rather than strength 7, and that's a big difference. I probably always give them Scything Talons just because they're only 4+ to hit, and they don't really have any way to buff that. So I really don't want to deal with that. And they can do 1 psychic power, and of course they are Synapse and Shadow of the Warp. Moving on to troop choices, Tyranids of course have tons of options for troops, the first one being Tyranid Warriors. These guys are way better now. They're still 6-inch movement. You have to bring Shrikes to get the larger movement. I think they're 12-inch movement. They're 3+ to hit in close combat, 4+ in shooting, which is kind of what they were before because they had weapon skill 5, ballistic skill 3. And there's still the same number of wounds, the same save. But in the new game, in 8th edition, having 3 wounds is actually a good thing now. They're not going to be easily double tapped out. As soon as they get hit by a strength 8 weapon, they're not going to lose all their wounds. Although a lot of those high strength weapons will do -3 or D6, or D6 wounds, but still there's a chance that a warrior can survive that. And then they have access to all the normal weapons. They are Synapse creatures as well, and Shadow in the Warp, and they can be given adrenal glands to get that extra charge. So they're really good now. They're solid choices. They're not as fast as a lot of other things, but you can kit them out to be good shooters. You can kit them out to be good in close combat. The nice thing as well is bone swords have an interesting rule. I've seen this with chain swords. I've seen it with a lot of other weapons where basically if you're just equipped with it, you get to have 1 extra attack that you do with that weapon. So if you want to make them really close combat, because you can give them bone swords and scything talons, and then if you want to just use the scything talons, you still get that extra attack with the bone swords. And then you also have the option to use the bone sword as well. So most things, if you give them 2 sets of close combat weapons, they don't get bonus attacks. They just give you a choice between which ones you're going to use. But the bone swords do allow you to get the extra bonus as well. But I still like equipping them with a good close combat weapon and with a shooting weapon as well. And now when you bring larger units, for every 3 models, they can take one of the bigger guns as well, rather than just 1 model in the entire squad, which is really nice. Gene Stealers are ridiculous now. I already talked about them a bit. 8-inch move, 3+ to hit. Broodlord nearby makes that 2+. They can advance and they can charge, and they got a 5-up invuln, which is super awesome. And they have 3 attacks. So they basically took the Gene Stealers and brought them in here, which we desperately needed. And if there's at least 10 models in the unit, and when they're fighting, they actually get 4 attacks instead of 3, which is super awesome. The advancing and charging is huge, especially with an 8-inch move. Imagine a Swarm Lord nearby. These guys move 8 inches plus in advance. Oh, by the way, you can give them never mind. You can't give them adrenal glands. I thought you could give them adrenal glands. So you're not going to be able to get that +1 advance and charge. So scratch that. But still, with a Swarm Lord nearby, they could move 8 plus D6. Then he could make them move 8 plus D6 again. And then they can still charge. So they're getting into combat. Let's just put it that way. Even just with the 8 plus D6, you're going to get them in combat, and they are super awesome in combat. And even though they are not, you can get them out of Synapse, and most likely they'll still survive morale tests because they're leadership 9, and there's usually less models, so you take less casualties before you're actually taking your morale tests. Termagants are still Termagants. They basically are just your fodder. They're cheap. They're good troop choices. They're especially good when you're using Termagants to kind of buff them. And if there's 20 or more in a unit when you fire, you can reroll wound rolls of 1. So that's just a nice little buff that they gave them. Hormagaunts are also awesome. They are now 8-inch move. Other than that, their stats have pretty much stayed the same, although Scything Talons let you reroll 1s to hit now, so they brought that back. That was from an older Tyranid Codex. And their Bounding Leap special rule, which allowed them to run faster, now lets them pile in and consolidate 6 inches. I want you to realize how big a deal that is. When you charge, and then maybe what I've actually had happen in a game is I've had more than 1 unit charge the same enemy, and then chargers all get to go first. So I choose a unit and I kill the enemy. Then I come to the Hormagaunts, and they can activate still because they charge, because you can only activate in the fight subphase if there's an enemy within an inch or if you charged. So if these guys don't have an enemy to fight anymore, they can pile in 6 inches to the nearest enemy unit and then consolidate 6 more inches to the nearest enemy unit. They won't be able to fight it because they didn't charge it, but they could go and tie up a tank or tie up something else that really wants to shoot. That's a 12-inch combined pile in and consolidate, which is a big deal. And you can give them adrenal glands to give them the +1 advance and charge. They can't charge if they advanced unless you put a psychic power on them, but still, you just +1 to each of those. Hormagaunts are going to get into combat. Ripper Swarms are still Ripper Swarms. They're your cheapest troop choice, so you'll probably see a lot of them just for that fact, that they can kind of fill in the gaps when you want to bring certain detachments and get the bonus command points. They're not really anything special. They have their Spine Mods still, which are now pistol 4 shots each, strength 2, but only 5+ to hit. It used to be 2 shots twin link, so this is what I'm talking about, where everything is just twice as many shots and not twin linked anymore. And so they're fine, and they can also burrow by default. They don't have to pay for it, where they can basically do the deep strike 9 inches away special rule. Into elites, Tyrant Guard are now elites rather than another HQ choice that you bring with Hive Tyrants. And they're great. They kind of do what they did before. They can have the Crushing Claws for the extra strength, or they can do the Lash Whip and Bone Sword. Lash Whips now, essentially if you die, you still get to fight in close combat if you hadn't had a chance already. It's kind of like the Wolfen special rule, except that it's not an additional attack. It's just if you hadn't attacked already. On top of that, they have the Shield Wall, that if a Hive Tyrant or Swarm Lord loses a wound while they're within 3 inches of this unit on a 2+, you can not take the wound on the the Swarm Lord or Hive Tyrant, but instead they take a mortal wound on the Tyrant Guard instead. And it's mortal wounds so that they don't get any saves. I don't think you'd be able to get Catalyst on both of these just because you can only do it once. It's not like you'll be able to double up on the 5+ either. So these guys are a really good shield wall. Take up an elite slot, which in some ways is good because it leaves you more HQ slots for your awesome Turvigons, Old One-Eye, Brood Lords, and all of those things right now. Hive Guard have received a bit of a buff. They're back to hitting on 3s. So they went through an addition of 3+ to hit, then they went to 4+ to hit. Now they're back to 3+ to hit, which is great. Although their Impaler Cannon is now a heavy weapon, so if they move, they're back to hitting on 4s. So if you want to move, they're hitting on 4s. Stand still, they're hitting on 3s. But it is 36-inch range. It's strength 8, -2 AP, and D3 damage. And they don't have to have line of sight to the target, and you don't get any cover benefits. Kind of like the way it was before. The shot cannon is really cool. It's Assault D3, 24-inch, strength 7, D3 damage, -1 AP. But if it hits a vehicle, if you roll a 4+ to wound, then in addition to whether that did a wound or not, it takes a mortal wound. If you roll 6+ to wound, it's D3 mortal wound. So that's kind of the new haywire rule, I think, which is why I'm really disappointed that in the Tau, a lot of their vehicles are classified as monsters, which doesn't make any sense. They did change it for the Grey Knight's Dread Knight and other ones that used to be monsters. I'm trying to remember what they are, but it doesn't matter now. So I'm almost thinking that that's a mistake on Games Workshop's part for not switching the Riptide back over to being a vehicle, because rules like this would matter. And don't tell me there's a pilot so you can poison them. Land Raiders have pilots, Rhinos have pilots, everybody has pilots pretty much, except that maybe the Tau stuff perhaps. But that's the ironic part, that they're the ones with monsters. So either way, though, putting that little rant aside, the fact that they have that extra damage against vehicles makes the shot cannon actually really useful as well. Lictors are really cool. They hit on 2+ in close combat, 4+ shooting, but they only have their flesh hooks anyways. And they only have 3 attacks, which I'm kind of disappointed by, just because I feel like they should have more than that. The other thing that's kind of weird is they're an elite choice, but you can only bring 1 as an elite choice, whereas they used to be brought as broods of 1 to 3. Now they're just single models. So if you want to spam lots of lictors, well, in a regular detachment, you're only going to be able to bring 3 to 6 elites, and so you're going to be competing once again for those elite slots between them and other things. Other thing is the Death Leaper, which is, well, we'll say it's this guy. We don't really have a specific model for him. He's really cool as well. He is now an elite choice rather than a HQ, so you can't make an all-lictor army, because there is one detachment that's 1 HQ and then 3 to 6 elites. So it would have been cool if the Death Leaper was an HQ choice, but he has a really nasty special ability. Normally all the Deep Strike rules, you have to place your model more than 9 inches away from any enemy units. Well, he has one that's called It's After Me, that during deployment I can set him up in the hunt, and then at before the first person takes their first turn, I pick a character, so my opponent knows which character he's after. And then when I Deep Strike the Death Leaper, I have to place him within 6 inches of that character, although more than 1 inch away. So my opponent will know who it is, so if he's smart, he'll bubble wrap him, because otherwise I'm going to place him 1.5 inches away and then charge and kill him. Although once again, the Death Leaper only has 4 attacks. He does have 6 wounds, he's more survivable. And he has, basically all lictors and him have chameleonic skin. Lictors, you get -1 to hit them, period. Close combat, shooting, doesn't matter. And he has superior chameleonic skin, so it's -2 to hit him. So that will make him much more survivable. I'm just kind of disappointed that they only have 3 attacks on lictors and 4 on him. I felt that they need more than that, because a lot of characters I've noticed, even like the really weak ones, have 3 or 4 wounds. And so having only 4 attacks, sure, you hit on 2s, but you're not likely to actually kill him if you fail just one of those. There's no rerolls anywhere as well. But still, the -2 to hit him and the It's After Me special rules are really cool for the Death Leaper. And the lictors, of course, can Deep Strike their 9 inches, and when they Deep Strike, they can reroll their charges on that turn. Malice Scepter is back. He's not as horrible as he was before. He is much better. He's a lot of points still, but I think you're going to find him much more useful. He can actually do some damage in close combat, just because he has massive Scything Talons, which are strength 7, -3 AP, and D6 damage each. And even though he only hits on 4s, he gets to reroll failed ones of 1, so that lets him hit a little bit better. He's a Psyker. He is a Synapse creature. He has a 5-up invuln. He can do 1 power per Psychic phase. He knows Smite and 1 other. But the other thing is he gets +1 to his Psychic tests, which is really nice. So he can pull off Smite on a 9+. All of a sudden, he's doing D6 mortal wounds rather than D3. And the other thing is he has a Psychic Overload special rule, which is instead of doing any Psychic, he can target all enemy units within 6 inches, and he rolls a die for each of them. That's up to a maximum of 6 units, and once he's damaged, that number goes down. And on a 2+, each unit takes a mortal wound. So you roll a die for each of them, 2+ mortal wound, 2+ mortal wound, 2+ mortal wound. Now I played them in a game, and I never used that ability because I always found it was more useful just to try to cast Smite, because with this +1 to hit, I am much more likely to do d6 mortal wounds. And also, it's not very often useful to just take off one mortal wound from a bunch of units. Because if they're infantry, so what? They lose one guy. If they're bigger guys, they take one mortal wound. Maybe if I saw a guy was down to a mortal wound and I really wanted to hit him with it, but still, once again, Smite might work better as long as they're the nearest enemy unit. Other than that, though, the Malice Scepter is actually much better and useful in the game. Zoanthropes are pretty cool. They still kind of perform the function they used to. That they only have Smite. They don't have Warp Blast anymore, but Smite works very similar to that, especially now that it just kind of does vehicles, monsters, or infantry all the same. But the nice thing about Zoanthropes is two things. If you give them a Neurothrope, then anytime they remove a model, each time they remove a model, they regain D3 wounds lost early in the battle. My question for this, which I haven't been able to find the answer for, is does that resurrect dead Zoanthropes? Because it's kind of strange that they, for whenever it slays an enemy model, with Smite they get D3 wounds. They only have 3 wounds each, so you're never going to be able to, if you roll a 5+ on the D3, you're never going to get all 3 of those wounds back. I think it's supposed to resurrect, but I can't say that for certain, so I'm not going to play it that way until there's an FAQ or until we can prove it some other way. But it does sound like what they should be able to do. Furthermore, if there's 4 or more Zoanthropes in a unit, whenever they do Smite, they do D3 additional mortal wounds, which is nice because if you're lacking for elite slots, meaning that you're running out of elite slots, instead of bringing 2 units of 3 and doing Smite twice, you can bring a unit of 4+ and just do it once with an additional D3, which is actually quite nice. If they have 4 or more as well, they can also do 2 psychic powers instead of 1 per turn, which is very useful because, well, it's useful to be able to do more than 1. And it's also nice because, like I said before, if you're running out of elite slots, it doesn't suck to put them all into one group and say, well, now I can only do 1 power. Well, now if you have 4 more, you can still do 2 powers. So they don't lose that ability as they go. They still have a 3-up invuln as well, which, you know, that kind of sucks. I appreciate the 3-up invuln to keep them alive, of course, but just having seen the way the game works, there is a lot of mortal wounds out there, so maybe we'll see people ignoring it a lot more often. But just think there's a little too many 3-up invulns in a game that has really added in all the armor modifiers and everything else like that. I would rather see things like Storm Shields or their Warp Field give them a bonus to armor, like a +2 armor. Even on a Terminator, giving them +2 armor would be great. He has 0+, still fails on 1s, and somebody hits him with a -3, all of a sudden they have a 3+ save. They hit him with a -4, they have a 4+ save, so they're still giving them a save. And if they hit by the last cannon a -6 AP, then all of a sudden they got a 6-up save. Or maybe they have a minimum 5-up invuln at that point. I would have preferred those mechanics more than others, but it is what it is, and that is just how we're going to have to play it. Venom Throws are pretty straightforward. Pretty much everything, all units within 3 inches of them that are infantry, so it doesn't work on monsters or vehicles, that are Tyranids, you get -1 to shoot at them. It's hit rolls from range, so it's not close combat, it's just shooting. Also, at the end of the fight subphase, you roll a d6 for every enemy unit within an inch of Venom Throw. On a 5+, they take a mortal wound. So there's basically this toxic miasma that's all around them. And they're actually pretty good in close combat too, with the ability to reroll failed wounds. And they always get to fight first, because before Lash Whips give them that +3 initiative. Now they just always fight first. If your enemy charges, then you'll have to alternate who goes first, of course. But it's just nice that they actually get a chance to do some damage, because they do have a couple attacks sitting on 4s. And then re-rolling the failed wounds as well gives them a little of extra punch. Pyrovores are pretty cool. Their Flame Spurt, what used to be their Flamer, is a 10-inch range Assault D6, Strength 5 -1 AP auto hit Flamer. So it's basically a heavy Flamer with a range of 10. The cool thing about that is if you stick them inside of a Tyrannocyte, their deep striking transport, you have to stay more than 9 inches away from the nearest enemy. And the fact that they have a 10-inch range weapon means that you can actually do first turn drop pod flamer assaults, whereas most armies won't be able to do that because most flamers are only 8-inch range. So if you drop pod in a unit of Space Marines with flamers, they have to stay more than 9 inches away. They won't be able to fire them. But Pyrovores could do that. And the Tyrannocytes are pretty expensive, so I'm not sure if it'll always be useful. But Pyrovores only have a 5-inch move, so it's going to take them a while to get there. In close combat, they're pretty cool. They only hit on 4s, but they are Strength 5 -3 AP in close combat. But whenever they take a wound, you roll a die. On a 6, the enemy unit takes a mortal wound. And whenever he dies, on a 4+, the nearest enemy unit within 3 inches also takes a mortal wound. So there's this little extra chance that they do some damage. I wouldn't recommend that they're really good in close combat. They do have a pretty good bite, but it's more get them up there, use their flamer, and then if you have good targets, then charge them in for that kind of thing. Haruspex is still terrifying. He has a move of 7 now, which will help him get in close combat a lot faster. He's got the Acid Blood rule that the Pyrovore does. Whenever he loses wounds on a 6+, the enemy takes a mortal wound. That's in close combat. And he's got Rapacious Hunger. He has a Ravenous Maw, essentially, which is at his full strength. He's strength 7, -1 AP, D3 damage apiece. But every time he makes an attack with it, he does D3 hit rolls for each attack made with this weapon instead of 1. So he's got 4 base attacks. So if you want to use his Ravenous Maw for all of them, then he gets 4 D3 attacks. Still only hitting on 4s, which kind of sucks, but with how many there are, that's pretty good. Now, whenever he slays an enemy model with that Ravenous Maw, he can then immediately make 1 extra attack with his Shoveling Claws, which are strength 14, -3 AP, and D6 damage. Now, you can always choose to use those instead, but obviously being able to go in with 4 D3 attacks, hitting on 4s, probably wounding on 3s, except little guys, you'll be wounding on 2s, toughness 3. And then he gets all those extra attacks as well, which is pretty awesome. One special rule that I haven't really been mentioning is that a lot of these big creatures have death throws. It's kind of like a vehicle exploding. When they die, you roll a D6. If you roll a 6, then nearby units take mortal wounds. So he's got that special rule as well. So it's kind of an equivalence to exploding that the vehicles usually have. Not seen here is the Red Terror. I don't have that model. He's good in close combat. He's got the Swallow Whole special rule, but other than that, he kind of operates the way you'd expect. And Tyranid Shrikes, which I really need to add, because they have a 4+ save. In 7th edition, they had a 5+ save, so now they're just Tyranid warriors with wings. They're fast attack instead of troop choices, but given a 12-inch movement and having pretty much exactly the same profile as warriors, meaning their Synapse, Shadow and the Warp, and all their other things, is going to make them super deadly in 8th edition. Continuing with our fast attack, we've got our Ravan Errs, which are also much better just because close combat has really improved. And they don't have access to adrenal glands, but they move 12 inches. They don't have fly, so they still have to adhere to terrain and everything like that. But they're hitting on 3s in close combat. They can deep strike more than 9 inches away from the enemy. Same thing as before. They could have Scything Talons, Rending Claws. They can have shooting weapons as well, hitting on 4s. So they're actually quite useful and quite deadly in the 8th edition meta. Gargoyles are pretty much what you expect. They've got the stats of a Termagant, except they have a movement of 12, and they have the Fly special rule. And other than that, they have Blinding Venom in close combat, which is just their strength 3 hit. But if the enemy takes any unsaved wounds, they get -1 to all hit rolls for that unit until the end of the turn. So it's before, as if you just got hit, then you pass an initiative test. Otherwise, you were reduced to weapon skill and ballistic skill 1. So this one, you just have to wound them once, and the whole unit gets -1 to hit for the rest. And just like the Termagants, if there's 20 or more Gargoyles, they could reroll wounds of 1 when shooting. Other than that, they're just Termagants with wings. The Harpy and the Hive Chrome, it's hard to say whether they've been buffed or whether they're the same kind of power level, but they're definitely interesting. They have the fly rule, and they have a minimum movement. And if you read the rules, if you don't make that minimum movement, then you're automatically dead. You can't fly off the table. But unlike a lot of the flyers, they don't have any restrictions to which way they have to move. So they don't have to turn 90 degrees and then fly. They just have to move 10 inches. So they're never going to really not be able to go where they need to. Even when they get down to 1 to 3 wounds and they can only go 10 to 15 inches, your opponent would have to totally bubble wrap 15 inches around them to kill them, and that just seems a little overkill. So movement-wise, they're pretty cool. They'll have to always break from combat, but because they have fly, they don't care. So they don't get to choose between the 2 modes. They're always flying, essentially, so there's no more gliding and swooping for our flying monstrous creatures. So these guys act more like the flying monstrous creatures did before, but with some differences as well. I'd say overall, the Harpy definitely has seen, probably I'd say a buff, just because his weapons are much more effective when you look at the way they work. Like before, the heavy venom cannon was a blast, and so using it against strength, it was strength 9, but using it against big things was kind of a waste because it didn't have a good AP and it only do 1 damage. Well, now it's D3 shots, because that's what small blasts do now. Strength 9, -1 AP, and it does D3 damage apiece. So I'd say that's a definite buff, that it's going to be good for dealing with other monstrous creatures or monsters and vehicles, essentially, or other multi-wound, anything. And you can always swap that out for the Stranglethorn Cannon, which is Assault D6, because it's a large blast before. Strength 7, -1 AP, 2 damage apiece, so that's also good for multi-wounds. And if you're firing at a large squad, 10 or more, he gets +1 to hit, so he'll be hitting on 3s rather than 4s. He's not too bad in close combat either, being at strength 6, -2 AP, D3 wounds, re-rolling 1s to hit, when he's hit on 4s. And he gets to drop Spore Mines. Spore Mines are really weird. I'll talk about them right now, and then as we talk about Biovores and Spore Mines, you'll kind of see how they already work. Essentially, whenever you're hitting a unit with a Spore Mine, it's no longer about being this big blast that hits a lot of guys. It's actually become more of like I'm not even quite sure what you're supposed to use it against. Essentially what happens is whenever you hit a unit with a Spore Mine, you roll a d6. On a 2 to 5, they take 1 mortal wound. On a 6, they take d3 mortal wounds. So it's not going to be good against mass infantry, but just doing 1 mortal wound against an enemy that you want to use mortal wounds against, it's probably not going to be a big deal either. But when he flies over a unit, he can roll a d6 up to 3d6, but there has to be, it's 1d6 per enemy model in that unit. So if the unit's only 1 guy, you only get to roll once. If he's 2 guys, you get to roll 2, and if he's 3 or more, you get to roll 3 dice. On a 4+, they get hit by a Spore Mine, so that's where you roll the d6 again to see how many mortal wounds they take. So not bad, there's 3 chances to do it, and the nice thing is whenever you miss, and this goes for the Biovores as well, then you place a Spore Mine more than 3 inches, but within 6 inches of the target. The reason it's more than 3 inches is because at the end of the charge phase, any Spore Mines within 3 inches of an enemy explodes, and you roll again. 2 to a 5 is 1 mortal wound, and the 6 is d3 mortal wounds. And the one that you drop, though, can't move or charge, so it's not able to charge that turn. So it's not going to be able to get in after it's within that 3 inches, so you have to wait till your next turn to be able to move it. And the Spore Mines never give victory points. They never hold objectives or contest objectives or anything else like that, just like they used to do. Now, it's cool when Harpies decide to charge, enemy units within an inch can't choose to fight until they're the last ones. So until all their eligible units have done so. They used to basically give minus initiative when they would charge in. So that's pretty cool. His shooting is really improved. The Spore Mines thing is kind of weird. I haven't really used the Spore Mines yet, so I can't say how effective they are, but it is a way for the Tyranids to do with mortal wounds. The Hive Chrome, the one on the left here, he's also interesting. He's got the, he doesn't have the same abilities to drop the Spore Mines, and he doesn't make you fight last when he charges, but he's the one on the Tentaclids, which are no longer 1 use only. They're 2 shots and strength 5, and once again, if they get to reroll against things with fly, so 4+ rerollable against fly, and just like the shock cannon on the Hive Guard, it's got the, not the haywire special rule, but essentially if it's hitting a vehicle, on a 4+, you take a mortal wound, and on a 6+ is d3 mortal wounds. Still has his Drool cannon as well, 8-inch range. It's just a strength 6 -1 flamer, and that's good. That's definitely good. 1 damage apiece. And in close combat, he's got a Wicked Spur. So before he could Vector Strike with strength 8, now he's got a 1 close combat attack, must be strength 8 -3, d3 damage, which is interesting as well. Other than that, they both do have Instinctive Behavior. They both move the same. They have the same stat line. Essentially, they're the same model, just with slightly different war gear. You got your Spore Mines as well. You got your Mucilid Spores as a fast attack and Spore Mines. And they all have that rule that I told you that with they move 3 inches first off. Now they could still charge, which will be a 2d6 charge. It doesn't slow down their charge at all like it used to. But once again, if they end their charge phase within 3 inches of an enemy, then they explode automatically. And on a 2 to 5, they do 1 mortal wound, and a 6+ they do d3 mortal wounds. But Mucilids on a 2 to 5 do d3 mortal wounds, and on a 6 they do d6 mortal wounds, and then they die. That's just basically it. And you never have to pay for them. If you have, you'll find out some things that create, everything that creates Spore Mines, you might think, well, don't I need to allocate points to create those in match play? And it has a Living Bomb special rule, which goes over a bunch of things, but one of those things it says is you never have to pay the points for them. So they're free. So even though everything else that you spawn or you summon, you have to pay for, these ones, you do not have to do that. The Tyranids now have a dedicated transport. They already did. The Tyrannocyte never took up any Force Org slots, but now they just more specifically say he's a dedicated transport, so you can bring 1 for every unit that you're bringing. And essentially he can drop in more than 9 inches away, and he can bring 1 unit of up to 20 infantry models or a monster with 14 wounds or less. That is not another Tyrannocyte or Sporocyst. So they specified that, because theoretically in 7th, you could put a Tyrannocyte inside of a Tyrannocyte inside of a Tyrannocyte inside of a Tyrannocyte, and you could not prove rules-wise that you were not allowed to do that. I never did it because it just seemed silly, but yeah, I could see some people trying to pull that off just to daisy chain them all across the board, or like those Russian dolls that you see popping out of each other. And so he gets to bring in 1 unit. So unlike other dedicated transports, he doesn't really act like a dedicated transport just because you can't then re-embark and move around with him. But he can only bring 1 unit, whereas other transports can, just as long as you can fit guys, and you can put as many units as you want inside. So that does mean they're not going to be able to drop off Tyranid warriors with a Tyranid Prime, or Gene Stealers with the Broodlord, which is too bad, because it would have been nice if they could do that. And other than that, it just moves around. Its weapons have been greatly improved, because they just get a lot more shots. And like, for example, if you give them Barb Stranglers, 5 Barb Stranglers, they don't have to worry about which direction they're firing anymore. You just fire 5d6 shots at strength 5 minus 1. And he's only hitting on 5s, but if he's firing at a unit with 10 or more models, he actually hits on 4s instead. So that's really cool. Or you can do the Death Spitter in the 18-inch range. You can just do 15 strength 5 minus 1 shots. Or you can do the Venom Cannon, which at Assault is d3 shots each. So 5d3, strength 8 minus 1 shot. So those are actually good. But they have gone up a bit in points value. So you'll have to kind of pay for that extra goodness that they do bring to your army. You're still with me? Because we're in the heavy support now, which is our second to last one, because we actually do have a fortification now, in addition to the regular fortifications. So we got our Carnufexes. Carnufexes are awesome now. Their points value went down, and their effectiveness went up, except for their shooting, which I already talked about, that they still only get 12 shots with the 2 sets of Devours, but they no longer get twin links. So I don't know if that's an oversight. It feels like it is, because everything else got double shots. And this is not just me complaining, saying, oh, my guys aren't as good. It just feels weird that everything that was twin linked before gets ×2, except for the twin link Devours did not get that. So I think that's just strange. But either way, close combat, these guys are going to be much better. With a move of 7, that extra inch makes a big difference, especially when you can give them adrenal glands, so they can advance the first turn and get that +1 to their advance. So you're moving 7 plus d6 plus 1, so 8 plus d6. And after that, their charge is going to be much easier with 2d6 plus 1 on the charge. So I think Carnufexes, I'm always going to be treating this close combat. Maybe every once in a while, I'll try them out as a shooting Carnufex, but with only hitting on 4s and no way to re-roll that, because even the old One Eye does not give him +1 to that. He only gives him +1 in the fight phase. But they're just so good in close combat with 4 base attacks. They can have the monster Scything Talons. If you give them 2 Scything Talons, then they'll even get 1 extra attack with that as well, so become 5 attacks. But the Crushing Claws are really good, ×2 strength. So they're only strength 6. They received a major debuff to their strength. They're toughness 7 with 8 wounds now. So they are quite nasty. They're much more survivable than they used to be before. And with toughness 7 and 8 wounds and a 3+ save. And so you can either do Scything Talons, strength 6 -3, 3 wounds, re-rolling 1s, or you can do the Crushing Claws, which will be strength 12 -3, but then they only hit on 5s, unless there's an old One Eye nearby, which I would recommend with these. They have Bioplasm upgrade as well, which is d3 shot, strength 7 -3. And whenever they charge in a 4+, they do a mortal wound just from charging, which is pretty awesome. So I think we're going to see Carnufexes doing quite well. On top of that, you can buy them in units of 3. They deploy together within 6 inches, but after that they act independently. And in 8th edition, pretty much all the missions I've seen, you do alternate deployment, and whoever finishes first gets to choose who goes first. So it's kind of a big deal that I can plop down essentially 3 units of 1 Carnufex each, and then have a better chance of going first. Now, of course, if I really want to fill out my heavy support for some prerequisites, I could split those 3 up into 3 heavy support, but it's going to be such a big deal to be able to choose to go first as the Tyranid player that I'll probably be doing that more often. We inadvertently talked about the Biovores already, having talked about the Harpy. They are totally different in what their purpose is now. They're no longer anti-infantry, because each of them only fires 1 shot. It's a heavy weapon, hitting on 4, so if they move, they'll be hitting on 5s. If they hit, then of course we do the Spore Mine thing, roll a die, 2 to a 5, 1 mortal wound on a 6, d3. If they miss, you place a Spore Mine more than 3 inches, but less than 6 inches away from the target, and that's it. That's all there is to them. They're units of 1 to 3, but we're going to have to find out what their niche is. It seems like they're meant to go after elites. It's not really anti-vehicle, because it's just 1 mortal wound most likely each, but maybe if a vehicle's down to only a couple of wounds, you want to fire them? I'm not quite sure. Maybe it's just a spamming of Spore Mines all over the table that you really want to do to distract your enemy. But now that everybody can split fire however they want, killing a toughness 1, no save, well, technically Spore Mines have 7+ saved, so if they're in cover they get 6+, but they're not going to be hard to kill. So it'll be interesting to try to experiment with these to see what their purpose is, because it's definitely not going to be the same as what it was before, which was killing infantry. The Trigon Prime, the Trigon and the Moloch are definitely a lot better now. Trigon Prime having 6 attacks, but he gets 1 extra because he has so many Scything Talents. He has 7 attacks that reroll 1s to hit, and he hits on 3s, and they're strength 7 -3 AP and d3 or d6 damage apiece. He's going to be awesome, and he has a movement of 9 until he's damaged, and he could deep strike as well. And when he deep strikes, when you put him in the Subterranean Assault Reserve, you can choose another infantry unit, troops unit to bring with him. And this is a big deal because once again, with alternate activation, you want to be the first one to finish. So in my game against the Tau, for example, I noticed that that Cullen he got to place first. We both had exactly 12 units, which means he would finish before me and get to choose who goes first. So I took a unit of Ripper Swarms, put it with the Trigon, and now all of a sudden I had 11 things to deploy. and I was able to finish first and get first turn. And that was a big deal, being able to manipulate it like that. So like I said, in the games, it feels like I'm playing this game right from the actual deployment and everything else like that. The Trigon Primes are cool because they're Synapse. They got their bioelectric pulse, but really it's all about that deep strike, getting in there in close combat and just doing a wicked number of attacks. The Trigons are essentially the same thing, except they have, well, essentially they're not Synapse, is really what it comes down to. So you got to be careful with the fact that they have to charge the nearest thing. Their stat line otherwise is identical in movement and everything else like that. They still have the massive Scything Talons. Their bioelectric pulse is only 6 shots instead of 12, but I've never found that to be a big deal, especially because you can give these guys adrenal glands and toxin sacs to do so much more damage. And they can also do the subterranean assault and bring a unit of troops with them as well. So it's almost like I'd rather use Trigons as my dedicated drop pod assault transports rather than the Tyrannocyte, although the Tyrannocyte is pretty awesome in its shooting abilities. We also have the Moloch, which is interesting. He's actually pretty good in close combat now. He's got more attacks than the Trigon. He's got 8 attacks. He only has regular Scything Talons though, so it's just strength 6, AP nothing, only 1 damage apiece, rerolling 1s. But actually he has 9 attacks because he has 3 pairs of them, so he gets to make an extra attack for having 2 or more pairs. And the cool thing though is that his distensible jaws, so that mouth of his, each time he fights with that, or each time he fights one of his attacks, and only one, must be made with that. And that one's the same stats as a Scything Talon, except it does D6 damage instead of 1. And he also has to use his tail once, which is strength 6 and D3 damage. But he's got Terror from the Deep. So before he would deep strike and do damage when he hit guys. Now you just, when you deep strike him, he has to deploy more than 1 inch away and more than 6 inches away from other Molochs. But he can deploy 1.5 inches away from the enemy. He can't charge when he comes in, but after he comes in, then you select a unit that's within, you roll a d6 for each enemy unit within 2 inches of it. Sorry, not just one. Each enemy unit within 2 inches. On a 1, nothing happens. 2 to 3, they take a mortal wound. 4 to a 5, they take D3 mortal wounds. And on a 6, they take 3 mortal wounds. And then at the beginning of your movement, he can burrow, but he can't burrow and come back in the same turn, because you could actually get him down, and at the end of your movement phase, you could theoretically say he could come back, but it specifies that he can't do that. So they still have their Terror from the Deep. They get 1.5 inches away from the enemy, do that mortal wounds. They don't get to charge, but they're so good in close combat that if the enemy decides to charge them, and they're 12 wounds, toughness 6, 3-up save, they're actually going to be good in close combat. In 7th edition, I do their Terror from the Deep thing and then hope that they didn't get in close combat because they sucked. They really, really sucked. They don't hit as easily as a Trigon Prime or Trigon because they hit on 4s instead of 3s, but they're still really good, and I think we'll see even more of them than we did before. Exocrines are even awesomer than they were before. They were already a good choice, but now they're even better. Close combat, they're all right. They've got a few attacks, strength 7, -2, but these guys are toughness 8, 12 wounds, 3-ups. They're not dying very easily. I'm not sure why they're toughness 8. They don't look that big, but they are. But the more important thing is their Bioplasma Cannon, which is 6 shots, strength 7, -3 AP, 2 damage apiece, is even better when they don't move. When they don't move, they get +1 to hit, so they're hitting on 3s instead of 4s, and they can fire it twice, so it becomes 12 shots instead of just 6. That's a new thing. I don't know why they doubled it, but they did. So it's don't stand still, hit on 3s, and you get 12 shots. You move, well, you're hitting on 5s because it's a heavy weapon and he doesn't have anything to ignore that. And so if you really need to move them, then you can, but it's got a 36-inch range, so most likely you can find some sort of target, especially if you deploy them properly. So I think for shooting armies, you're going to want a couple Exocrines, and these are heavy support, so they'll take that spot of what the DACA effects used to be, and I'll just bring Exocrines instead, because that is a lot of shots and very, very effective. Carnufexes are also scary too, being toughness 8, 14 wounds, only 3-up save. They don't have 2-up save anymore, but still with 14 wounds and toughness 8, they're going to be sitting around for a while. And they can move and fire heavy weapons without any modifier to their hit rolls, but you're going to want to be standing still a lot, because if they don't move, they can shoot all of their weapons twice in the shooting phase. Now they only have 1 shooting weapon. They no longer have access to all the extra stuff. Although it does have Stinger Salvos as well, so sorry, they have 2 weapons. And so you give them Acid Spray. It's an 18-inch D6 shots. It'll be strength 7, -1 AP, D3 damage that automatically hit, and they could fire it twice. So you get within 18 inches of this guy, he'll stand still and he'll hit you with heavy 2d6 auto hits, strength 7, -1. Now the strength of that weapon is tied to how much damage he's taken, so he could actually get lower as he gets hurt. Or you can give him a Flesh Borer Hive, which is heavy 20, or heavy 40 if he stands still, strength 5. It used to be strength 4, but now it's strength 5, 1 damage each, no AP. Or you can give him the Rupture Cannon, which is heavy 2, And when he fires, that strength 10, minus 1 AP, 2 damage. But if both shots hit, then it becomes minus 4 AP, and the damage is D6. Now, he's only hitting on 4s, so once again, I'm probably never going to bring the Rupture Cannon. But if he stands still, you can fire it twice, but I'm assuming you fire it twice and you fire it again. Oh, sorry, you fire it 2 shots, and you fire 2 shots again. You wouldn't roll 4 shots, and then whatever that would be. And the Stinger Salvo is nice, 4 assault shots, strength 5, minus 1 AP, 18-inch range, and he stood still, he could fire that twice as well. So that's pretty awesome that he has that really, really good shooting ability. So between him and the Exocrine, you got your heavy support shooting tied down. But if you're looking for close combat, the Toxicrin is going to be awesome now. He's toughness 7, 12 wounds. He's got a 3-up save now, no longer 4-up save, which is nice. And hitting only on 4s in close combat, but he always gets to attack first in the fight phase because of his whips. And he is, when he's not wounded, strength 7, minus 1 AP, D3 damage apiece. And he gets to re-roll failed wound rolls when attacking with this weapon. Remember now, vehicles, you wound. So all these things that before were re-rolling wounds that didn't really work against vehicles, these guys are good against vehicles now. The Toxicrin wasn't good against vehicles, and now it is. So you have to remember that. The Carnufexes, my Turvigons, the Hive Tyrants, Toxicrines, the Trigons, these things that sucked against vehicles are now going to be super good against them as well. So you can actually bring, Nidzilla is back. Nidzilla is back. You can bring a monstrous creature list, and you'll actually do really well with it. So the Toxicrin is good in that way. He's also got some acid stuff, so if you wound him on 6s, you take mortal wounds. And at the end of the fight phase, on a 6+, anybody within each enemy model, sorry, it's a D6 for each enemy model, I thought it was unit, within an inch of a Toxicrin on a 6, that model, oh sorry, the model's unit suffers a mortal wound. So if you're surrounded by a bunch of little guys, you might be rolling like 10 dice, and any 6s you roll, just wounds taken off. And that's at the end of the fight phase. That's before morale checks are taken. So that is pretty nasty. The Toxicrin is actually going to be good in close combat, whereas before he was, not really good at all. And last up, we got the Sporocyst. He is a fortification now, which is really cool because there's a fortification detachment, which is 1 to 3 fortifications. It doesn't give you any bonuses, but it just allows you to bring him without him taking up a heavy support slot. So he gets to fire Spore Mines. So he doesn't create Spore Mines, he just fires them, but then they get created if he misses. And if he's within Synapse range of a Synapse creature, he's also a Synapse creature, so he extends the Synapse range in a sense. He can't move. He can shoot his weapons even if they're within an inch, an enemy's within an inch of him, because he just doesn't care. And having 12 wounds at toughness 6 as a 4-up save means that he's not going to be easy to kill. And during deployment, you can set up a Sporocyst in its hive ship instead of placing it. And then at the beginning of the first battle round, before the first player's first turn, then you launch him and set him up anywhere more than 9 inches away. So you don't get to put him at the end of the movement phase. You actually set him up before the game starts. And then he shoots Spore Mines, and he's also got the options for the Death Spitters, Barbed Stranglers, and Venom Cannons that the Tyrannocyte has. So I think I'd be more likely to bring Sporocyst than Tyrannocytes, just because I can bring Trigons to transport units into the battle, although it's only troop units with the Trigons, but that's usually the ones that I want to consider anyways. Whew, all right, well that was a mouthful. Went over every single unit there, which was quite a bit. Hopefully you were able to get a lot from that, because I wanted to really give you an overview of what has changed for the Tyranids, having played them for so long now, for just so many years, almost 10 years now. And so seeing them go through the various editions, going from 4th to 5th to 6th to 7th to 8th, just seeing what becomes good, what's no longer good. Essentially, here's what I think about them overall. They are going to be able to be viable as a pure close combat army, and they're going to be able to be really good at Psychic, and they're going to have some really threatening things for shooting as well. Shooting-wise, I think other armies will be able to outshoot them, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to be terrifying when they decide to go for shooting. I think a mix of shooting and close combat will be good, or a pure close combat army is going to be the way to go with the Tyranids from now on, which is exactly the way I think they should be played. So that's the end of this first part of the review, which ended up being quite long. The second part, you can get the link in the video description below for our Vault members, is going to be me going over some list builds that I think will be useful in this. Some of them will be some theory hammering, having only played a few games with them, but I want to talk about things that I think will kind of work out well for them. And that's for Vault members, of course. If you're not a Vault member, you can still click it, get a free 7-day trial to the MiniWarGaming Vault. If you're not a Vault member yet, and you haven't tried it out, I really strongly hope that you will. We're putting out a ton of content for 8th edition stuff, so you'll get twice as much of it, twice as many battle reports and reviews as those who are just browsing for free. And that is what allows us to run our business. I want to stress that. People say, well, why can't you just do advertising? Advertising does make us a bit of money, but not really anywhere near the amount that we need to run our business. And the Vault is what allows us to do that. So if you want to help support us, then a Vault membership is the way to go. If you're able to do it, of course. I know some people can't, and that's perfectly fine. So go check it all out. Links below for the next review and the 2 battle reports for today. Thanks for watching. Happy wargaming.